The tow truck driver looked at me with pity as he hooked chains to my grandfather's boat. Sheriff Karen stood there with her arms crossed, that cruel smile spreading across her face as neighbors gathered to watch my humiliation. "Maybe next time you will think twice before trespassing on public property," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. I felt my hands shake with rage and helplessness. But what she did not know was that I had just discovered something in my grandfather's old papers. Something that would change everything. 3 months before Sheriff Karen destroyed my life, I was the happiest man in the county. My grandfather had left me his lake property when he passed, and I spent every weekend morning out on that water with a fishing line and a cup of coffee. The mist would rise off the surface like ghosts dancing, and the only sounds were loons calling across the water and the gentle lap of waves against my boat. I never thought much about property lines or legal documents back then. My grandfather had always been a simple man who believed in handshake deals and treating neighbors with respect. When the local fishing club started using the area near my dock, I figured they had permission from someone. They seemed like decent folks, old-timers mostly, retirees who loved the water as much as I did. "Morning, Jim," they would call out when I putted past in my little aluminum boat. I would wave back and sometimes stop to chat about what was biting or how the weather looked. There was Tom Henderson, who always wore that faded Vietnam veteran cap. Betty Morrison brought homemade sandwiches for the whole group. Carl Stevens knew every fish in that lake by name, or so it seemed. They had built a small wooden platform on the shore and kept a few lawn chairs there. Nothing fancy, just a place to sit and cast their lines. I never minded. The lake was big enough for all of us, and my grandfather had always said there was no point in being greedy with God's creation. Those were peaceful days. I would get up before dawn on Saturday mornings, make my coffee in that old percolator grandfather left behind, and head down to the dock while the world was still quiet. The water would be glass smooth, reflecting the pine trees and the sky like a perfect mirror. I could spend hours out there, not caring if I caught anything or not. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. I had a wooden box full of my grandfather's papers sitting in the closet, stuff I never bothered to look through. Old receipts, insurance documents, things that seemed too boring to matter. If I had opened that box even once, everything that happened later could have been avoided. But I was content to live in ignorance, content to share what I thought was my small piece of paradise with neighbors who seemed to appreciate it as much as I did. I had no idea that some of those friendly faces were already plotting against me, or that they had been lying to me from the very first day we met. The fishing club had their routine down to a science. They would arrive every morning just after sunrise, set up their equipment with military precision, and fish until the sun got too hot. They treated that little section of shoreline like it belonged to them, but I assumed they had worked something out with the county or whoever owned the land. I should have asked more questions. I should have looked at those papers. But hindsight is a cruel teacher, and I was about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when my peaceful world exploded. I had just finished tying my boat to the dock when I heard heavy footsteps on the wooden planks behind me. I turned around expecting to see Tom or one of the other club members, but instead I found myself face to face with a tall woman in a sheriff's uniform. She was imposing in a way that made my stomach drop. Broad shoulders, mirror sunglasses that reflected my confused face, and a gun belt that creaked with every step. Behind her stood a younger deputy who kept his hand resting on his radio like he was expecting trouble. "You need to move that boat immediately," she said without introduction. Her voice cut through the morning calm like a blade. "I am Sheriff Karen Martinez, and I am responding to multiple complaints about your trespassing on public property." I blinked at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Trespassing? Ma'am, I think there has been some kind of mistake. This is my property. My grandfather left it to me." She let out a harsh laugh that made my skin crawl. "Your property? Sir, this entire shoreline is designated public access for the county fishing club. They have a valid lease, and you are interfering with their legal use of this area." I looked past her shoulder and saw several club members watching from their platform. Tom Henderson would not meet my eyes. Betty Morrison turned away when I looked at her. Carl Stevens actually smirked and shook his head like I was some kind of fool. "I do not understand," I said, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. "I have been coming here for months. Nobody ever said anything about trespassing or leases." Sheriff Karen stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell her perfume mixed with gun oil. "Well, I am saying something now. These good people pay their fees to use this facility, and they should not have to deal with some squatter disrupting their peaceful fishing." The word squatter hit me like a physical blow. I had lived in this county my whole life. I had gone to school with half these people, and now I was being called a squatter on my own grandfather's land. "Ma'am, if you could just give me a chance to show you some paperwork, I think we can clear this up real quick," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and respectful. She adjusted her sunglasses and crossed her arms. "I do not have time for your stories, sir. I have a report here that says you have been harassing these club members and blocking their access to legal fishing areas. Now you can move that boat voluntarily, or I can impound it as evidence of trespassing. What is it going to be?" I felt the world tilting under my feet. Everything I thought I knew was being turned upside down by this woman's absolute certainty. She spoke with the kind of authority that made you doubt your own memories. "I will move it," I said quietly, "but I would really appreciate the chance to show you my grandfather's deed, and maybe we can figure out where the confusion is." Sheriff Karen laughed again, that same cold sound. "Confusion? Sir, the only confusion here is yours. These people have been using this area legally for over 15 years. Your grandfather never owned anything more than that little cabin up the hill." She turned to address the fishing club members like I was not even there. "Folks, I apologize for this disruption. This individual will not be bothering you anymore." As I untied my boat with shaking hands, I heard Tom Henderson call out, "Thank you, Sheriff Martinez. We really appreciate you handling this situation." I putted away from my own dock feeling like a criminal, while the woman who was supposed to serve and protect treated me like garbage in front of people I had considered friends. Sheriff Karen was not content with just one humiliation. Over the next month, she made it her personal mission to make my life miserable every time I set foot near my own lake. What started as a misunderstanding became a campaign of systematic harassment that left me questioning my own sanity. The first citation came 3 days after our initial encounter. I had parked my truck in the same spot I always used, 50 yards from the shoreline, when Deputy Williams appeared with his ticket book already open. "Sir, you are parked in a designated emergency vehicle zone," he said, not looking up from his writing. I stared at him in disbelief. "Deputy, I have been parking here for 6 months. There is no sign, no paint on the road, nothing that says emergency zone." He handed me the ticket with a shrug. "Sheriff Martinez had the county update the designation yesterday. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse." $60 fine for parking where I had always parked. When I drove back the next morning, there was a small, barely visible sign tucked behind a tree that read, "Emergency vehicles only." It looked like it had been put up 5 minutes before I arrived. The pattern escalated from there. Every weekend brought a new citation, a new rule I had supposedly broken, a new way Sheriff Karen could flex her authority. Fishing without a county permit, even though I had a valid state license. Disturbing the peace by starting my boat motor before 7 a.m. Operating an unregistered watercraft, even though my registration was clearly displayed. Each time, the fishing club members watched with what I can only describe as satisfaction. They had gone from friendly neighbors to hostile strangers who whispered among themselves when I appeared and made loud comments about troublemakers and people who do not respect property rights. Some folks just do not understand how things work around here, Carl Stevens said loudly one morning as I walked past their platform. Think they can do whatever they want without consequences. Betty Morrison nodded along. It is such a shame when outsiders come in and try to disrupt a peaceful community. Outsiders. I had lived in this county longer than half of them, but now I was an outsider because I dared to question Sheriff Karen's authority. The psychological pressure was incredible. I would wake up on Saturday mornings with my stomach in knots, wondering what new surprise was waiting for me at the lake. I started leaving later and later, hopping to avoid the morning rush of club members and deputies. I changed my routine, my parking spots, even the days I visited, but somehow Sheriff Karen always seemed to know when I would be there. The breaking point came on a cold October morning when I arrived to find Deputy Williams and another officer waiting by my usual dock. They watched me approach with the lazy confidence of cats watching a cornered mouse. "Morning, sir," Deputy Williams said with mock politeness. "Sheriff Martinez asked us to inform you that your continued presence in this area constitutes criminal trespassing. Any further violations will result in arrest and impoundment of your vehicle and watercraft." I felt something snap inside my chest. Criminal trespass. Deputy, this is my grandfather's property. I have every legal right to be here. The second officer stepped forward. His name tag read Johnson, and he had the kind of face that had seen too many years of small-town bullying. "Sir, we have been very patient with you, but patience has limits. Sheriff Martinez has documented evidence of your harassment of local citizens and your repeated violations of county ordinances." What harassment? What violations? I have not done anything except try to fish on my own property. Officer Johnson put his hand on his radio. "Sir, I am going to need you to calm down and lower your voice. Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" That was when I realized the trap they had set. Any response that was not complete submission would be twisted into resisting arrest or disturbing the peace. They had maneuvered me into a position where I could not win no matter what I said or did. I got back in my truck and drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. For the first time since this nightmare started, I seriously considered giving up. Maybe Sheriff Karen was right. Maybe I was confused about what my grandfather had actually left me. Maybe I should just find somewhere else to fish and let these people have their lake. But that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out the truth, no matter what it cost me. The morning Sheriff Karen came to steal my boat was the lowest point of my entire life. It was early November, and frost covered the wooden planks of the dock like broken glass. I had arrived before dawn, hopping to avoid another confrontation, but she was waiting for me with a tow truck and 3 deputies. "Jim Parker," she called out as I climbed out of my truck. Her voice carried across the water with theatrical authority. "By order of the county sheriff's department, Your watercraft is being impounded for repeated violations of trespassing ordinances." I watched in horror as the tow truck driver began backing his rig toward my boat. This was not just another citation or warning. This was them taking the one thing that connected me to my grandfather's memory. "Sheriff, please," I said, walking toward her with my hands raised to show I was not a threat. "Can we please just talk about this like adults? I am not trying to cause trouble for anyone." She smiled that cold smile I had come to hate. "The time for talking is over, Mr. Parker. You have had multiple opportunities to comply with lawful orders, and you have chosen to continue this pattern of harassment and trespassing." By now, word had gotten out somehow, and neighbors were gathering to watch the show. Mrs. Peterson from down the road stood with her arms crossed. The Martinez family from the gas station whispered and pointed. Even some kids on bicycles had stopped to see what was happening. "You see, folks," Sheriff Karen said, raising her voice so everyone could hear, "this is what happens when someone thinks they are above the law. Mr. Parker here has been repeatedly warned about his illegal occupation of public waters, but he chose to ignore those warnings." The fishing club members stood on their platform like a jury delivering a verdict. Tom Henderson actually clapped when the tow truck driver hooked the chains to my boat. Betty Morrison shook her head in mock disappointment. Carl Stevens called out, "About time someone did something about this situation." I felt humiliation wash over me like a physical wave. These people had watched me get destroyed piece by piece, and now they were celebrating my final defeat. I was a grown man standing there helpless while a corrupt sheriff stole my property in front of half the county. "This boat belonged to my grandfather," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay strong. "It is all I have left of him." Sheriff Karen shrugged with theatrical indifference. "Well, maybe your grandfather should have taught you more about respecting other people's property rights." That was the moment something died inside me. Not just hope or dignity, but the belief that there was any justice left in the world. I watched them load my grandfather's boat onto that truck like it was stolen property, while the woman sworn to protect and serve treated me like a criminal in front of my own neighbors. The crowd began to disperse as the tow truck pulled away with my boat. People avoided eye contact as they walked past me, like I was carrying some kind of contagious shame. I stood there alone on the dock, staring at the empty water where my boat should have been. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying every moment of the morning's humiliation. I kept thinking about my grandfather, wondering what he would have done in this situation. He had always been a man who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. But he had also been a man who believed in fighting back when someone tried to take what was yours. That afternoon, I sat in his old kitchen chair and stared at the wooden box I had been avoiding for months. It was full of his papers, documents I had been too lazy or too grief-stricken to examine. Insurance policies, tax records, legal documents that seemed too boring to matter. But Sheriff Karen had taken everything else from me. My peace, my dignity, my grandfather's boat. The only thing I had left was the truth, whatever that might be. So I opened that box for the first time since grandfather's funeral and started reading. The first document I pulled out was a property survey from 1987. The second was a deed from the county courthouse. The third was a legal description that made my hands start shaking as I read it. Because what I discovered in that box was not just proof that I owned the land around the dock. It was proof that I owned something much, much bigger than that. The legal documents in my grandfather's box read like a treasure map written in lawyer language. But once I started understanding what they meant, I could not stop reading. My coffee went cold as I spread papers across the kitchen table, cross-referencing property descriptions with old survey maps and tax records. The first shocking discovery was a deed dated 1962, when my grandfather purchased what was described as the entirety of Morrison Lake and surrounding watershed, comprising approximately 847 acres of water and adjacent land. Morrison Lake. That was the name of my lake, though nobody had called it that in decades. I found receipts for property taxes going back 40 years, all paid by my grandfather until his death, then automatically transferred to me as his heir. I had been paying taxes on 847 acres without even realizing it, because the county had been quietly deducting the payments from my inheritance account. My hands were shaking as I pulled out a 1963 survey map that showed the exact boundaries of the property. The fishing club's platform was not just on my land. It was smack in the middle of it, nearly half a mile inside the property line. Their entire operation was trespassing on a scale that made my blood boil. But the most devastating discovery was a folder marked Fishing Club Lease Agreement. Inside was a contract between my grandfather and the Morrison Lake Fishing Association, dated 1995. The lease granted them permission to use a designated area of the shoreline for recreational fishing, in exchange for annual payments of $500 and maintenance of the access road. The lease expired in 2015, 10 years ago. For a decade, they had been squatting on my property without permission, without payment, and without any legal right to be there. I called the county courthouse and spent 2 hours on the phone with clerks and supervisors, verifying every document and cross-checking every property description. By the end of those calls, there was no doubt about what I owned or what the fishing club had been doing. "Sir, according to our records, you are the sole owner of Morrison Lake and all adjacent properties within the surveyed boundaries," said Mrs. Henderson at the county clerk's office. "If someone has been representing that land as public access, they are either mistaken or deliberately misrepresenting the facts." Next, I called a property lawyer in the county seat and made an appointment to bring in all the documents. Attorney Sarah Mitchell reviewed everything within an hour and delivered the verdict I had already suspected. "Mr. Parker, you have been the victim of a systematic fraud," she said, looking up from the papers with barely controlled anger. "This fishing club has been operating without legal authority for 10 years, and whoever told law enforcement that you were trespassing either did not do their homework or was deliberately lying." She explained that my grandfather's estate had been properly probated, all property transfers were legally recorded, and my ownership was beyond dispute. The fishing club had manipulated local law enforcement by claiming public access rights they had never possessed. "What about Sheriff Martinez?" I asked. "Can she be held responsible for harassing me based on false information?" Attorney Mitchell's smile was sharp as a knife. "Oh, she can be held responsible for quite a lot, Mr. Parker. Harassment under color of authority, unlawful seizure of property, civil rights violations. When a law enforcement officer acts on false premises without conducting proper investigation, they lose their qualified immunity." That evening, I sat on my grandfather's porch with all the documents organized in neat piles, watching the sun set over my lake. Not the county's lake, not the fishing club's lake. My lake, which my grandfather had purchased with his own money and legally transferred to me. For months, I had been made to feel like a criminal and a liar. Sheriff Karen had systematically destroyed my reputation and peace of mind based on the word of people who had been stealing from me for 10 years. Tomorrow, that was all going to change. I called Attorney Mitchell and told her to prepare for war. I arrived at the lake the next morning carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and a heart full of righteous anger. The fishing club was set up in their usual spot, completely unaware that their decade-long scam was about to implode. I parked in my usual place, walked straight to their platform, and cleared my throat. "Good morning, folks," I said in the most polite voice I could manage. "I need to have a conversation with all of you about this property." Tom Henderson looked up from his tackle box with annoyance. "Jim, you know you are not supposed to be here. Sheriff Martinez made it clear that you are trespassing." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the property deed. "Tom, this document says otherwise. According to the county courthouse, I own this entire lake and everything within a quarter-mile of the shoreline. That includes the platform you are sitting on." The color drained from his face as I handed him the deed. Betty Morrison moved closer to read over his shoulder, and I heard her sharp intake of breath when she saw the property description. "This cannot be right," Carl Stevens said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We have been paying lease fees to the county for 15 years. I pulled out the expired lease agreement and handed it to him. "Your lease expired in 2015, Carl. You have been trespassing on my property for 10 years without paying a dime or asking permission." The silence that followed was beautiful. These people who had treated me like a criminal, who had celebrated my humiliation, were suddenly faced with the reality that they were the ones breaking the law. "Now wait just a minute," Tom Henderson said, standing up with the kind of bluster that comes from desperation. "Even if this paperwork is legitimate, we have been using this area in good faith. We did not know the lease had expired." I smiled at him with the same cold expression Sheriff Karen had used on me. "Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, Tom. I believe someone told me that recently." That was when I heard the heavy footsteps on the dock behind me. Sheriff Karen had arrived for what she thought would be another easy intimidation session. She walked toward us with that familiar swagger, completely unaware that the tables had turned. "Mr. Parker," she called out, "I thought I made it clear that you are not welcome in this area. Are you here to turn yourself in, or do I need to arrest you for criminal trespass?" I turned to face her with documents in my hand and steel in my voice. "Sheriff Martinez, I think you need to see something before you embarrass yourself any further." Her confident expression flickered as I handed her the property deed and tax records. I watched her face change as she read the legal description, cross-referenced it with the survey map, and realized the magnitude of her mistake. "This cannot be accurate," she said, but I could hear doubt creeping into her voice. "These people have a valid lease agreement with the county." I handed her the expired lease. "Had a valid lease agreement, Sheriff. It expired 10 years ago. Every citation you have written me has been based on false information provided by people who have been illegally occupying my property." The fishing club members started talking at once, voices overlapping in panic and confusion. Tom Henderson was frantically dialing his phone. Betty Morrison looked like she might cry. Carl Stevens kept shaking his head and muttering about misunderstandings. Sheriff Karen studied the documents with growing horror as she realized that every action she had taken against me was not just wrong, but potentially criminal. She had harassed a property owner, illegally seized his boat, and violated his civil rights based on the lies of trespassers. "I am going to need to verify these documents," she said, but her voice had lost all its authority. I pulled out my phone and showed her the contact information for Attorney Sarah Mitchell. "My lawyer is expecting your call, Sheriff. She has some very interesting things to tell you about qualified immunity and civil rights violations." For the first time since this nightmare began, Sheriff Karen looked uncertain. The woman who had humiliated me in front of half the county was suddenly faced with the reality that she had destroyed her own career by failing to do basic research before acting. "I want all of you off my property immediately," I said, addressing the fishing club. "You have 24 hours to remove all your equipment and structures. After that, anything left behind will be considered abandoned property, and I will dispose of it as I see fit." Tom Henderson tried one last desperate appeal. "Jim, we can work something out here. We can pay you rent, maybe even a lump sum to settle this misunderstanding." I looked at him with the same pity the tow truck driver had shown me. "The time for working things out was 10 years ago, Tom, or 3 months ago when I tried to talk to Sheriff Martinez like a reasonable adult. Now it is time for consequences." As I walked back to my truck, I could hear them behind me, their voices raised in panic and anger. But for the first time in months, I was not the one who was afraid. Attorney Sarah Mitchell filed the paperwork with the efficiency of a surgeon performing a familiar operation. Within 48 hours, every member of the Morrison Lake Fishing Association received formal notice of trespassing charges, along with a demand for 10 years of back rent and damages to my property. Sheriff Karen's situation was even worse. Internal Affairs opened an investigation into her conduct after my lawyer submitted a formal complaint documenting harassment, illegal seizure of property, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. The county sheriff's department had no choice but to take action when faced with such clear evidence of misconduct. "Mr. Parker," said Captain Rodriguez during our meeting at the sheriff's department, "I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received from our department. Sheriff Martinez acted without proper investigation and caused significant harm to your reputation and peace of mind." He handed me keys to my grandfather's boat, which had been returned from the impound lot with a full tank of gas and a written apology. "We take these matters very seriously, and there will be consequences for the officers involved in this situation." The fishing club members tried every desperate measure they could think of to avoid the legal reckoning. Tom Henderson called me personally, offering to pay $5,000 in cash if I would just forget the whole thing. Betty Morrison sent her daughter to my house with a sob story about fixed incomes and medical bills. Carl Stevens was the most pathetic of all. He showed up at my door with a check for $10,000 and tears in his eyes, begging me to have mercy on an old man who had made an honest mistake. "Carl," I said, looking at him through my screen door, "3 months ago I tried to have an honest conversation with you people. You chose to humiliate me instead. Actions have consequences." The county courthouse became a busy place as Attorney Mitchell filed motion after motion to recover damages and establish my property rights permanently. She arranged for new survey markers to be installed around the entire lake perimeter, along with signs clearly stating that this was private property. "The beautiful thing about property law," she explained to me over coffee, "is that it does not care about feelings or friendships or community relationships. You either own the land or you do not, and you own this land free and clear." Sheriff Karen's career imploded exactly as Attorney Mitchell had predicted. The internal investigation found multiple violations of department policy and basic police procedure. She was placed on administrative leave pending a full review, which meant she spent her days at home while investigators documented every illegal action she had taken against me. The local newspaper picked up the story when the court filings became public record. "Local property owner vindicated after months of police harassment" was the headline that made me smile for the first time in months. Within 2 weeks, every structure the fishing club had built on my property was gone. The platform, the chairs, the little storage shed they had constructed without permission. My shoreline looked exactly as my grandfather had left it, clean and natural and peaceful. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like justice was not just a word people threw around in political speeches. It was something real, something you could fight for and win if you knew the truth and had the courage to stand up for what was right. 6 months later, I sat on my dock watching the sunrise paint the water gold and red, holding a cup of coffee that actually tasted good for the first time since this whole ordeal began. The legal battles were over, the trespassers were gone, and my lake was peaceful again. Sheriff Karen Martinez was no longer Sheriff Martinez. The internal investigation had resulted in her termination for abuse of authority, harassment, and violation of civil rights. She was currently working as a security guard at the county mall, a fact that gave me more satisfaction than it probably should have. The fishing club members had all paid their fines and back rent, though the amounts varied based on their ability to pay and their level of cooperation. Tom Henderson ended up owing $12,000 in damages and legal fees. Betty Morrison qualified for a payment plan based on her limited income. Carl Stevens had to sell his truck to pay his settlement, which seemed like appropriate justice for a man who had enjoyed my humiliation so thoroughly. But the real victory was not financial. It was the restoration of my reputation in the community and the knowledge that bullies had faced real consequences for their actions. "You did the right thing," Attorney Mitchell had told me when we signed the final settlement papers. "Too many people let corrupt officials get away with abuse because they are afraid to fight back. You stood up for yourself and probably prevented them from victimizing someone else." The new property signs were works of art, professionally made metal markers that clearly identified Morrison Lake as private property with no trespassing or public access. I had also installed a gate across the access road, though I kept it unlocked most of the time. It was more about making a statement than keeping people out. Word of my victory had spread through the county, and I noticed a change in how people treated me. There was respect there that had not existed before, the kind of respect that comes from knowing someone will not be pushed around. Mrs. Peterson waved when she drove past my road. The clerk at the hardware store asked how the fishing was going. Even some of the deputies who had participated in my harassment nodded politely when they saw me in town. My grandfather would have been proud, I thought as I watched a blue heron land near the far shore. He had always believed that a man should stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. The morning routine was exactly as it had been before Sheriff Karen destroyed my peace of mind, but with one important difference. Now I appreciated it in a way I never had before. I understood how precious it was to sit on your own property without fear, to enjoy something beautiful without looking over your shoulder for trouble. I had learned that justice was not something that happened automatically. It was something you had to fight for, document carefully, and pursue with determination even when everyone around you said you were wrong. The system only worked when people were willing to make it work. As the sun cleared the tree line and began warming my face, I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to my grandfather. He had left me more than just a lake and a boat. He had left me the tools to defend what was mine, and the example of how a man should conduct himself when faced with injustice. Sheriff Karen had taught me that some people will abuse any power they are given, but I had taught her that some people will not be bullied, no matter how much authority you think you have. The lake was mine, the peace was mine, and the knowledge that I had stood up to corruption and one would be mine forever.